Lots of people build tribal commander decks, but not all tribes are as equal as others. So I want to take some time to highlight some of the lesser played tribes, why they struggle in commander, and some ways you can make them a little bit better. We're back, and today we're going to look at a tribe that's just got a bunch of new support, Nightmares. With only 132 decks on EDHREC, they are a pretty uncommon tribe to actually see played, but with 15 new members from Duskmourn and a long history through Magic, I think that number's soon gonna rise. In total, there are 89 Nightmare creatures in Magic, with the first ever printed in Alpha, which was the original Nightmare in both name and type. There's even a banned Nightmare, though it's not actually a creature. Though obviously starting in black, through the Torment and Judgment sets, we'd see the tribe expand into blue and red before almost disappearing from Magic for 14 years until they popped up again in Shadows over Innistrad. Since then, the tribe has made repeated appearances until being a major tribe again when we visit EDHREC and now Duskmourn. And with Duskmourn, we also saw them spread well around the colour pie, with only green really lacking any Nightmares of note. The original Nightmare is a depiction of a demonic horse of old Germanic folklore, which would be more well known from Dungeons & Dragons these days. But obviously that's a very restrictive theme, so future printings of Nightmares are basically any scary creature with a sort of overlap with the horror type. We have nightmare beasts and crabs and dragons and a barbarian among others, with Nightmare basically just being a scary version of other creature types. Because of this, Nightmares don't really have much of a mechanical theme to link them together, often just being a few in number in a set and just adopting whatever that set was doing or having generic abilities. So what are the potential commanders we have in this tribe? Well, for once we have a lot of choice here. With 14 legendaries, we have every colour available to build in and a lot of variation. A lot of this is thanks to EDHREC, of course, which was a 3-colour set, and therefore the commanders were also 3 colours. Some of the standouts within the commanders would have to be Nethroi, Apex of Death, as a sweet graveyard commander, Braid's Arisen Nightmare for a mono-black value deck, and Umbra's Fear Manifest, who has an ability powered by Nightmares. We also have a potential companion with Lurrus of the Dream Den, though with the requirement of a deck with mana cost 2 or less, this cannot really be used with the tribe. And we also have Falthus, Shadowcat Familiar, who has Partner. But again, no other Nightmares have Partner, so we'd have to partner them with a non-Nightmare. And of course, with this many options, there are plenty that don't actually fit the tribe very well. Such as Ovika, who has an ability that creates Phyrexian goblins, Zaxra, who does things with Hydras and X spells, and there are no other Hydra Nightmares or Nightmares with X in their cost. And then there's Sylvar, who has Partner with a human, and cares about sacrificing humans, so not particularly useful. And Tayum, who can recur 3 mana or less cards from the graveyard, which doesn't really hit a lot of Nightmares. Lastly, in Duskmourn, we've had a new commander with the Mind Skinner, a mono-blue 1/10 that mills players instead of doing damage. A really cool commander in my opinion, but in mono-blue, you're gonna have a hard time getting enough Nightmares to make it tribal. But wait, what's that? It's another commander that cares about Nightmares? Why yes, it's the commander Kahira, the Orphan Guard. Despite being a cat beast, they give +1/+1 and vigilance to Nightmares. And if you only have Nightmare creatures, they can also be a companion, which I found really on theme for the deck. So that leaves us with 2 good options in my mind for tribal Nightmares. Either you go with Umbris, which is basically just an Umbris deck but only with Nightmare creatures, of which you have a decent choice in blue-black. Or you go with Nethroi and Kahira as a companion with a Graveyard Recursion Nightmare tribal. That deck will give you a bit more flexibility in how you can brew, since it's 3 colours, though it does have a very Ikoria flavour to it. So how about those creatures? Well, mechanically they don't really fit together that well. So let's break them up by subtype this time. First off, the most obvious, the Nightmare Horrors. Faceless Butcher, the Black Fiend Hunter of combos, Gravegorger, Hypnox, who's just a big boy, Laquata's Champion, Mesmeric Fiend, Slithery Stalker, Soul Scourge, Faceless Devourer, who has Shadow, Psychic Symbiont, and Void Beckoner, another big boy. These are mostly in black and do black abilities. Next, the Nightmare Beasts. Petrodon and Petrovarch, who are basically unplayable. The 4 Wormfang, who are also basically unplayable. But then when we get to the more modern beasts, we have Leyline Prowler, who's a mana dork, the Beast Commanders from before, and lastly a Boneyard Lurker, who does graveyard recursion. The Ikoria beasts aren't bad, but you really can't play the old blue and red nightmares. Not really, their downsides are just too bad. So the next creatures are the horses, the original nightmares. Of course that includes Nightmare, who is perfectly playable still, and then Carnival Hellsteed, who hits, Stallion of Ashmouth, Plague Mare, who can kill mana dorks, and Underworld Charger, who has Escape. These are okay, but they're more filler than powerhouses. You might say they don't have a lot of horsepower. After this, we start getting into the one-off nightmares. So we'll hit some of the all-stars. The Demon Doom Whisperer, who can dig through your library with life, great for recursion decks. The Angel of Suffering, who turns damage to you into mill instead, also good for recursion decks. Well-Gorger Dragon, who's part of a CEDH combo and not really good for tribal nightmares, so just don't do that. The Finks Dream Eater, who just has some solid abilities. The Snake Zagoth Mamba, who works with mutate cards. A Nightmare Wall called Gibbering Barricade, which can be used to sacrifice creatures. And lastly, Spellgorger, the only Nightmare human in the list, Nightmare Human Barbarian. What a strange type. And finally, there are the pure nightmares with no other creature type, like Braids, who we mentioned earlier, a powerhouse of a creature, Dread Presence, who can do a variety of helpful things, Fiend Artisan, who works great with recursion, a bunch that care about mutating onto them with various abilities, and the set of Fear Nightmares from Duskmourn that all just have really interesting abilities to use. Before we move on though, we have a couple of nightmare cards from outside the tribe too, with Restless Fortress that can transform into a nightmare, Nightmare Shepherd, who makes nightmare copies of other creatures that die, and Cacophony Unleashed, which becomes a nightmare god when enchantments enter play. There are also several Ashiok Planeswalkers that create nightmare tokens, and quite frankly, Ashiok is basically a nightmare themselves, so would easily fit into a tribal deck in the right colours. Duskmourn also just gave us Ancient Cellarspawn, who makes nightmares easier to cast, despite being a horror. And I of course have to mention Chthonian Nightmare because it's the closest we have to a legal recurring nightmare at this point, which is just a flavour win for me. So how do we actually build a nightmares deck? Well, I think looking at these creatures, one thing really stands out. We have a lot of nightmares that work great with the graveyard, especially in green and black. While the Umbrus deck triggers off nightmares, for an Umbrus build, you just build an Umbrus deck and fill it with as many cheap nightmares as you can to get as many triggers as you can, with maybe Faceless Butcher being the real standout since you can bounce stuff on and off the battlefield. But otherwise, it's just an Umbrus deck with support cards that help the commander, not the tribe. So that leaves the much more interesting build around Nethroi and Kahira. We have several nightmares that can pull cards out of the graveyard with Boneyard Lurker, Lurrus of the Dream Den, Necropanther, and Tayem. Then we have Ashiok's Reaper, Fiend Artisan, Cathril, and Wicked Visitor, who want us to fill the graveyard. And lastly, Doom Whisperer and Angel of Suffering to help do that graveyard filling. We also miss out on running most of the Ashioks, but we do still get Ashiok the Wicked Manipulator, who is just a good planeswalker to use. In this colour combination, we have 50 nightmares to choose from, giving us lots of choices with which to fill the deck with. I would recommend some of the creatures that want to be mutated on, since Nethroi is going to be used that way. And we have some big bodies with Hypnox and Void Beckoner, and of course just Braids for lots of value. It's a complete smorgasbord of choice. Otherwise, you just build a solid green-black self-mill deck with plenty of ways to put stuff into the graveyard as you do that. You know, play all the favourites like Altar of Dementia and Mesmeric Orb and Crawling Sensation, and then animate dead, victimize, or reanimate to pull those nightmares back out again. So overall, how would I rate nightmares as a tribe? Well, they are really good. Like, this is a really solid tribe to build around these days, with lots of commander options, good creatures to pick from, and some themes to build around, even if they are a bit generic. Umbrus is the most obvious commander, but I personally think Nethroi is the better choice for proper tribal. About the only thing they lack is proper synergy and unified flavour. Just looking at all the nightmares coming in Duskmourn, I think we can expect this tribe to keep growing now that it's getting some serious support. However, they do often get mixed in with horrors, so hopefully they don't suffer a merge sometime in the future. Thankfully, Ikoria Nightmares sort of go in a different direction to the horrors, so I think that's still unlikely for now. But that'll do for Nightmare Tribal. And until next time, thanks for watching.